Originally, my undergraduate degree was in biochemistry, and although I love science, I wasn't too much a fan of being in the laboratory. So after I was done, I was fortunate enough to get a position working in a science museum in my hometown, where I worked on a medical artifacts collection and doing research about the history of these artifacts and their provenance. And it was there that I had a great experience with my curator, who suggested I study more of the history and philosophy of science. So eventually, when I went to the University of Toronto for my master's, I fell down the philosophy rabbit hole, asking questions about why we present science the way that we do. And so a lot of my current research in science communication really draws back on my time in science centers and science museums and my thoughts on how science could be better framed to effectively reach the public. So for me, it was important to get involved in a project looking at public trust and expertise because as a philosopher working in values and science communication, experts are often asked to communicate their research. And so for me, it gave me a chance to look at how this position of expert or how someone having expertise can be impactful in a social sphere. So the question of whether or not there's been an erosion of trust in experts is a big one at the moment. And this question has come to the forefront for a multitude of reasons. Part of that is social media seeming to make many people experts, but also a recognition and a questioning of what does it mean to be an expert. So I think that although there has been some challenge to what expertise is, that doesn't mean that we automatically distrust every expert. I think people are much more selective about their skepticism and the experts they trust and distrust. What my collaborators and I worked on were these social dimensions of trust that are different than the evidence that experts provide. And we give an argument that part of what makes an expert convincing or trustworthy or someone you want to put your trust in is the social indicators that are associated with them. So social indicators of trust are cues in our environment that inform us or give us information to help us get an idea of an expert or a person. And my colleague, Gloria Origi, would speak about how these social indicators of trust inform reputation, whereas I, for example, look at values as a social indicator of trust. So values as social indicators of trust are complex, socially, culturally dependent, and in some ways subliminal. We aren't always aware of what values and cues we're picking up on when people communicate with us. So I would say that lay publics have different degrees of contact with different experts. Your medical doctor or your pharmacist, you have a face-to-face interaction with. They know your profile, they have your dossier. So the trust you put in them and the trusting relationship you have with them is different than the relationship you have with a social person or someone on social media. A science communicator who's very popular, you're obviously much further removed from that individual and are forced to decipher the cues provided through the medium of social media differently than were it in person. I don't know if it's really possible to disentangle what might be non-epistemic cues, so cues about specific types of values, maybe be personal, political, social, from epistemic values, so related to getting closer to the truth. So, for example, reliability, proximity, consensus, these sorts of values. I don't think they can be separated. They're all used in integrated ways, and that's because science is never value-free, and certainly not free of non-epistemic values. What matters is how these values are being used. So I think it's worth refining the definition of the value-free ideal, because it's not as if the value-free ideal says that you can't ever use non-epistemic values in science. It recognizes that non-epistemic values have a quite valuable or beneficial role, for example, when deciding on research questions, whether or not you want to use animal models, and what methods you're going to use. What the value-free ideal prohibits is the use of non-epistemic values, like concern for public health, when evaluating evidence and setting thresholds for appropriate evidence. However, the many challenges to the value-free ideal have pointed out that not only are non-epistemic values pervasive in science, but even in these latter stages where we're evaluating evidence, to set those thresholds, it requires someone somewhere to decide how much evidence is going to be enough. And when deciding what amount of evidence is enough, you inevitably take on a risk of either making a false positive or false negative statement. And so because there is always this chance of error, this risk, people have argued that we might want to be cautious depending on what we suspect the implications could be. And it's this concern for the implications of science and maybe getting it wrong that demonstrates there is a useful place for non-epistemic values in science, contra to the value-free ideal. I think this is a legitimate concern. However, science, even under the value-free ideal, has been very biased and continues to be in many ways and for many different communities. The subjects we study, the participants we use, all of these decisions have the risk of some bias being involved and still do in many ways. What I think many scholars, including myself, would like to see more of is a transparency about the non-epistemic values being used in these decision-making processes, like when deciding on research subjects or setting thresholds for acceptable evidence. I think the idea is that by providing more transparency about the non-epistemic values being used, we can at least attempt to verify whether or not they're appropriate. Whereas under the value-free ideal model, we wouldn't even be allowed to discuss them. We assume that they're not there. And without being able to have that discussion, it's hard for science to improve. I'm not arguing that science comms should be informed by non-epistemic values. It is. There's no way around that. If people are doing it, it's informed by non-epistemic values because we have non-epistemic values inherent to how we think about and engage with the world. So we know it's no longer enough just to convey the facts of science or the empirical data. You can throw as much empirical data at people as you want, but it's not necessarily going to provoke a change in them or get them to receive that information. But we've seen concerted efforts by different science communication campaigns to frame the information in relation to things and values that people are passionate about. I think the worst thing one could do is dismiss public concerns outright without really trying to understand where those originate from. So when someone asks, is the vaccine halal? That is a non-epistemic value-based concern. It has legitimate reason to be asked. Dismissing it or not answering that question does more harm and raises more skepticism than I think is warranted, because answering this question and engaging with it directly would not only benefit community members that had that concern, but also scientists who maybe didn't think to raise the question themselves. And this is the benefit of having epistemically diverse communities and publics engaged with science, is that these concerns can be raised more fruitfully earlier to help move science along. Integrity, passion, and community. I say this because part of the reason that I do research in the philosophy of science communication is I think that the scientific community can better serve the society that it's situated in. And so part of my job and my attention to community and my passion for science communication comes from finding ways using a philosophical lens to refine how communication is done and how lay publics are perceived, so that we can form a cohesive community that's both rich and knowledgeable.